software engineer now, always been front end focused. Been doing web development professionally for over 13 years. And I have a few personal projects that have been keeping me busy during pandemic times and has opened my network to a lot more folks like Ben and yeah, just I'm always up for talking anything CSS, accessibility, general front end. So
Well, it's great to have you. I'd like to kind of show off a couple of the things that you've been doing. Kind of talk through those. For one thing, you just released a new Egghead course.
yeah, yep.
Uh,
I just had my first full length egghead course. I'd had some one off lessons. I've been with them as an instructor for almost a year. And so my course is about accessible cross browser form field styling. Um, so learning how to make those styles cross browser, but also about half the course is actually the semantics of how to set up the most common field types, inputs, radios, checkboxes, selects. So, and then ending with form layout, including field sets and things.
I love the focus on semantics there because I think so often the focus is on how can we make this pretty, but we don't really focus so much on the robustness that has to like power that. And that
Yeah,
that seems like a big recurring theme in your work.
yeah, it is. You're definitely right. And that comes from um, interesting kind of pathway to where I am now. I spent 8 years as a developer in marketing. And the first part of that, we didn't care too much about accessibility because it was not talked about as much. It just wasn't part of the industry standard, unfortunately. So we've obviously done a lot of improvement in just even these recent years. Um, and then being able to look at how we often offload forms to different tools. So I think it's really important to understand what's really happening there, even if it just means you can better evaluate when you seek out a solution. So the course is just vanilla HTML, CSS. We talk about what to be aware of for styling for validation rules, but we don't bring in any JavaScript to do that. So it's intended to be portable, like you could turn them into React components, Vue components, PHP, whatever you need to do. So
Awesome. I'm looking forward to that course. I think that's definitely one I'm going to be taking in some of my free time. Another thing that you've been working on as of late is Small CSS. Would you like to pull that up and kind of show
yeah,
us what that's about?
yeah. So this is my newest baby. um, and this has been, let's see, it'll only be 3 weeks this Thursday, I believe. Um, and this format has really been attractive to folks. So, for context, well, I think it's good context. I also have moderncss.dev, which is full length, very in depth written tutorials. Um, and I've been sharing tips on Twitter. A huge focus for me is that they're actually practical tips, they're not just fancy tricks.
Hmm.
Sometimes you can use them for tricks, but usually they're intended to be practical, like stuff I'm actually using. And so small CSS, I was like, I'd like to formalize, like sometimes you do need a little more context than a tweet can provide, but I wanted something more consumable than maybe digging through tutorial when you are just seeking a little bit quicker answer. So that's what small CSS is. So some of them are, everything is to the small theme, right? It's very scoped down to just the thing we're trying to address. At this point, there are 14 different demos, and they all are the base HTML, of course, big emphasis on semantics as much as possible. Um, Most of them are, set up to be generic, since the element doesn't always matter so far in what we've created. Um, but of course, making sure we have alt text. And then I also mention throughout if there's anything to know about, of course, support, like this one's using aspect ratio and is, which we might get into using today a little bit. And so it's exposing you to modern CSS properties, but also to maybe semantic side, and definitely emphasizing anything to be aware of for accessibility as you use some of these things. Yeah.
That's super cool. And I definitely really enjoyed seeing these tips get passed around Twitter. Just every time a new one comes out, it feels like it makes the rounds of just people I follow going, "This is super cool stuff. This is great." Yeah, and then I mean, you've done so much. You've put in you've put out so much great stuff. But the one that we're going to be focusing on today is Style Sage.
Yeah,
I would love if you could give a brief introduction to what that is as well.
definitely. So, as I mentioned, I've been around a while on the web. And so, one of the resources that I was very fascinated by when I was getting started was CSS Zen Garden. As you can see, still exists. And this was the idea, if you're not familiar, is that everyone who contributed had the same HTML file, and then they created their own CSS file. So you can see all these, like here's one by Dan Mall. And submissions for this stopped in, I'm going to double check what I said here, 2013. So consequently, CSS and the web at large has grown up a lot since then. And I love Codepen and similar environments for like being like, here's a small, focus thing, pretty cool. But I think but I enjoyed CSS Zen Garden because it allowed you to think of the page holistically, or your system of styles holistically.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that beyond personal portfolios, not everyone gets a chance to always do the whole project, right?
Mm.
So, and I'm also a big proponent of an advocate just for generally playing with things. That's how I learn.
Mm.
Everything that I put out there is from playing with it. You can read the docs, you can read the specs if that's your thing. But I think there's no substitute for play if you don't have like a professional capacity to practice some of these things. So yeah, so Style Stage has the same premise. The HTML that constructs this home page, everyone continues to use it throughout the styles that are available. So you can see there's quite a lot of background info you can see here. And then also the emphasis on modern CSS. So a few properties listed there. If you're not quite sure what we mean by that, so things like flex and grid, and then getting even really modern min, max, clamp, variable fonts. So really whatever you can bring in and has reasonable support, you can use, of course. So the contribution flow is that you actually submit them via GitHub, a pull request. The site is built with 11D, and so your style sheet comes in. You must provide a permanent external link to it, and then we kind of just bring that in. So there's a few ways to get started. You can do the Sass template if that's your preference, which is mine. That's how the base one's built here. Or you can download just the vanilla CSS and the HTML, or you can fork a Codepen. So there are lots of options to get you started or to help you kind of dig deeper. And then I actually have a nightly process that runs to change these featured styles, to try to give all the current ones some, attention. There are 54 styles.
Whoa.
Yeah, this launched last July, and we had quite an influx those first couple months. It's definitely slowed down, but some really, really excellent work here. And it's important to me to say that it's not a beauty contest. You will not be judged on what it looks like. The only thing is there are guidelines, but those have to do with being cognizant of accessibility things. And so mostly that means contrast. The theme includes skip links, so making sure you actually make that visible at the right time or at some point. If you use animations, using like the prefers reduced motion media query to turn those off. So if you've met all of those things, I'll review your PR. It gets its own preview branch so we can both look at it, make sure things come through. And then as long as the guidelines are met, we'll add it to the gallery here. So, yep, I will. It's been cool to have like a lot of different skill sets contribute, and
Mhm.
it's been fun to help people kind of maybe learn to notice some of those things I just mentioned, because that some of those things are new, like the prefers reduced motion media query. We can talk about that more later if folks here are not to have not used that before. So yeah, I definitely encourage you to go look at here. And so the other key part of this is that any of the style sheets that are made available are actually licensed under Creative Commons. So you shouldn't pick up and use it as your own design, but you can certainly use parts of it. You can be inspired by it. You can grab, for example, if you're like, whoa, how's this pattern created? You know, dig in. That's the other beauty of this.
Mhm.
Other inspiration for this was like, ooh, what is it on? It's on the body. There it is. Is that some of these modern ways that we build websites and the way that they add classes to things makes it very hard to scope down and find styles if you do have that, like, oh, how'd they do that moment?
Mhm.
So Style Stage makes that a lot easier because it is just HTML, just a normal link style sheet.
That's awesome. Yeah, and I think it's so cool just how different all the themes look. Like, yeah, they all have the same content, they all have generally the same structure, but they all look radically different in a way.
Yes.
And
Yep.
that's yeah.
And as you can see from the one I pulled up, again, they're all working with the exact same HTML
Mhm.
and just getting creative about, especially grid. Grid has really opened for this type of a thing. I mean, just, wild what you can do. The one accessibility thing I've been a teeny tiny bit lenient on, just because I'm not allowing you to alter the HTML, is occasionally we get the visual focus order a little bit off from the DOM order.
Hmm.
Um, Things haven't been too, unfollowable, I guess. But so we can, quickly get back to all styles. So as you get into one, you still have all the links available. They'll all continue to
Mhm.
work to get you back around to the directory and things. So
Uh, I think one of my favorites has to be Jet Set, which is the one that basically it's the theme that you would get if you turned like an energy drink into a website.
yeah, or like it reminds me of I think it's, I don't know. I don't do video games, but I think it might be based on a video game, or that's what it reminds
Yeah.
me of. It's like an old school, like, you walk into a video
Mhm.
arcade and it's like that intro screen. I can play it. A warning to anyone watching, it does flash.
Yeah.
So I will just play it for just a second. I'll tell you when it's off screen, but that's going to load right now. So yeah, it's got this. It is pretty amazing. The movement, the change in color of the background gradient. So yeah, big. I also love this. I'm pointing to my screen. You can't see that, but this stacking menu that happens is also very cool. Very excellent use of modern CSS properties and a really good spotlight of what can you do with just styles when you're just given some HTML to work with. So, okay, I will back out of that one. So it's no longer flashing on screen. But yeah,
Well, I have to say the chat is suitably inspired. Shepard is asking whether it's redundant to say how stylish the styles are. Um, Adrian says they're so aesthetically pleasing. Nasty Director says it's really inspiring to see just how different all the styles are. Yeah, the chat loves this. This is they're thrilled. So we're gonna build a theme of our own for the stream. So how do we get started with that, Stephanie?
yeah. So what I've done today is I have popped our HTML into a Codepen just for a little more easy to talk to and make changes to. Um, I have it bumped up here. Let me know if I need a change to a dark theme or anything for anyone. I'm happy to do that. Um, and so I just will start by kind of exploring what is the HTML structure. So once again, you're not allowed to change it. That includes you're not allowed to add classes. So you will get very familiar with CSS selectors. Um, I have been asked several times, do I think this is representative of real world? And yes, unfortunately, I do. because I've been there myself. Yes, even in today's world, because you have a good chance of encountering legacy things that for whatever reason you cannot change the underlying structure. Or maybe you're hooking into third-party tools and there is not a clean way to change the underlying structure. So yeah, either way, getting familiar with CSS selectors never hurts, even if you're using a framework or a library as well. So, so here's what we got going on. And of course, zero styles right now. I stripped all that away. So again, I mentioned the skip link. That's the thing I flag almost the most frequently on contributions, is forgetting to make that visible. And that's easy to do because you hide it initially, you get going on your styles and forget to jump back up to it, especially if you're not used to that concept, which I can mention real quickly. So a skip link, the intent of it is that someone using assistive technology, especially if they're maybe more familiar with the site, they can skip past navigation, past header content, all that blob of stuff that just is repeated on every page and just is annoying to navigate through if you're having to do it non-visually, and get straight to your actual content. So on style stage, you could argue it's not totally needed, but again, part of the aspect is to be an educational tool. So it's important to me to go ahead and include that. So what's happening is that it links to our main element. So it's a normal anchor link at the end of the day. And importantly, we have this tab index 1. So in other words, we want it to be focusable, but we don't want it in the normal tab order. So that's what's going on there. And obviously my brain was on React when I did this. That doesn't need to be capitalized. I need to make that edit. Just noticed that. All right. So what, now, I said you couldn't add classes. I've added a scant amount of classes just to enable styling hooks when it might be a little more difficult to do with selectors. I've also added some kind of superfluous divs, again, just to give you a tiny bit of extra help with styling hooks. Back to the, is this realistic question? Trying to make it a little a little more realistic to what you might do if you were trying to group elements and add backgrounds and what have you. So there are a few elements that get this class of container. For example, if you never use it, that's totally fine. And then also on a few links, they also have a convention link dash. So if our GitHub link that, as you can see, is SVG is totally overtaking the page right now. And it also repeats at the bottom of the page. But otherwise, we just have our kind of nice semantic markup. We've got our header, a nav, main. It ended up with 2 asides, one that contains your profile information, which this will dynamically update with the data you provide with your contribution. So that's taken care of. That will be personal to you on your style sheet page. And then it's important to keep in mind as well that these featured styles will change daily. So you can't count on them to be a certain character count. So for example, these happen to match the current, well, the ones from yesterday, because that's when I pulled the HTML. So whenever, if you choose to use the functionality of grabbing the HTML here, you'll get the actual current styles. So, yeah, so you have a couple of asides. So just kind of important to note that there's 2 of them. The reason for some IDs, you can of course use them for styling. They're there because of our nav using anchor links. Since it's a single page site is the main reason you'll see IDs. Yeah, and so, otherwise than that, standard kind of text markup things. Are there any questions that have popped up on any of that?
Not so far. If you have
Okay.
questions, feel free to get them in and get them in early. Just y'all know how bad Twitch lag can be, and we want to be able to get to them. We do have a comment from Nasty Director who says that legacy code makes them write some of their most, quote, creative selectors. Yeah, I think that really and truly, like, getting good at selectors is one of the key things to, like, really getting good at CSS.
Yeah, it's going to help you no matter what. Quick plug. My most recent articles out here are actually going through advanced CSS selectors. So if you haven't looked in a while, you probably are missing some of the newer ones, first of all, or especially the newer supported cross-browser ones. We're going to talk about one of my favorites for sure here in a little bit, but so that's out there. Okay, so this Codepen, I given Ben the link. This is a modified version from the one that is available on the main site. I made a skeleton version that gives you kind of core structural styles just to help visualize a little more. So I've stripped all those out. But speaking of fancy selectors, what I left in here is this one that I created a while ago that it's going to, we'll see what it does. I'm gonna let it do it, it'll be easier to explain. Okay, so what it's done is it's found every element that has a class or an ID, and it's actually pulled out the name of those values and appended it as either a before or an after. So the classes are appended.
We are exactly one tip in, and my mind is already blown. I did not know you could just like pull out the class name like that.
Yes, so that's coming from. So this is all vanilla CSS. This is not. I know it says Sass up here, but and we are using Sass, but this attribute is just CSS happening. So we're concatenating in a period to help us denote that it's class. Let's get down to so here's a ID. So we've made a different color. So just made this as kind of a debugging tool to help identify different things as you're starting to work through. So for example, we can quickly see like what elements have a container. Okay, so that star is getting a little obnoxious. So I'm sure most contributors probably first thing they do is let's address this SVG. We have it twice, but it's the same one. So we'll just generically attach styles to the SVG. There's of course a lot of ways we could do this. And I do have this set up not to auto run. Since it's a long scrolling page, I didn't want it to jump a lot. So it's hidden behind our before and afters, but at least it's more manageable size now. So, you know, since we only have half an hour left, we're not going to get too much into design. So we're going to focus more on structure and maybe some things to think about and around that.
Anthony's already saying one day he'll properly learn grid. So definitely if we can spend some time with your grid tricks, I think that would be super helpful.
Yeah, definitely. So let's do a couple things. Let's also get a reset started in here. I'm going to comment this back out for now. So it is a lot of noise, but can be helpful. So my original thing that I typically do is reset our box sizing. And I know there's different thoughts on if this should happen on the universal selector or, inherit from HTML, totally up to you. Keep in mind, this is a single page site. So while it's awesome to use it as a learning opportunity for stuff you can pick up and move project to project, I think it's important to keep in mind this is one page in terms of, again, learning about performance of choosing your selectors and thinking about the page as a single page whole experience. So we're going to do just this for simplicity today. We'll go ahead and the other thing is I'm in Codepen. I've removed the, it defaults to normalize as a reset. So I've actually turned that off. Keep that in mind if you choose to bring it into Codepen, that if you don't turn that off, that's also a dependency that you'll have to end up adding to your style sheet. So important to note there. Okay, so since I've turned that off, we will remove the margin that is a default on body. Let me run because I didn't actually get rid of the Okay. We'll set up a line height. Again, all this is personal preference. You literally have a blank canvas to do this project. So we'll keep it simple for now. Oh, keep forgetting I have to hit run. Cool. It's beautiful. It's readable, right? This is like what the platform gives us for free. It's already responsive. You know, we've got semantic HTML, so we can tell like the sections. I just had to say that because it's important. Cool. All right, so we might add a few more things into our reset, but that'll get us started here. Okay, so that container that we saw throughout, let's look again how that's constructed. So it's always inside of our main elements. And the reason I did that was to make sure if you wanted to add like a full width background, you weren't trying to like hack around it by only having the container class or only having the base element available to you. So in other words, we can use our container truly as a container and use that to start setting up like a max width, or we'll just start there. I'm fond of using CH units. That's going to map to the width of the 0 character in whatever font it's inheriting from. So keep that in mind. If you nest it down deeper, it will pick up its nearest ancestor's font width.
So you're making it 80 characters wide because otherwise, or I guess 80 zeros wide, because otherwise it just, the text just gets too wide and it's difficult to like scan left to right.
Exactly. Yep. So to help with legibility, and we're using it as a max width, so that way it will still respond down. And then a personal preference is for margin is to use view height units for our vertical margins. View heights usually makes me happy responsively, and then auto. Okay, so let's do that, and then that'll help us see where we have those different containers structured and what's left outside of them.
So this is 8% of the view height on the top, 8% on the bottom, and then it centers left to right because that's what the auto does.
Correct. So you can see here as I'm changing the height, you can see that height between containers also updating. So makes it nice and responsive because typically on a mobile device, it would be nice probably to have a little bit tighter space between elements. Absolutely. So just a nice little trick that I've started using. We might come back to one other thing, but I'm cognizant of our time remaining here. So we can see that the elements remaining outside, well, actually we can turn this back on real quick. Okay, so we've got our containers. We can see the remaining elements that are outside. The nav didn't get any kind of debugging assistance because there's neither class or ID on it. So we can see that things have worked as we expected. We can see where we have the additional IDs a little more cleanly now that it's not all smushed together. If anyone, let's deal with our nav, and we can use that to talk about grid a little bit.
Okay.
Okay, so again, since we just checked and we don't have a class or an ID, that leaves us with just the element itself as our selector. So inside, we just have a standard unordered list with links, with list items and links. We might want to, if you don't want to add a background here, we might just add it into our container class. So at least we've kind of aligned it with the rest of our content. And then we can either use Flex or Grid. There's a lot of considerations for that, mostly depending on how you want it to respond. Do you want it to respond sort of intrinsically, being the idea that you don't need media queries, that it just kind of does it? Or do you want it to be kind of more rigidly applied, in which case you might want to set it up in a way that does require media queries to adjust. And with this one, it's a little tricky, I think, because there's quite a few items and they have considerable length. So we'll do this real quick. So let me rearrange so we can see the screen and what we're working on a little better. So if we use grid, the quick way, or if we initially apply grid, it's going to not look any different. We can inspect to see why that is. Okay, so by default, oh, actually, we actually need to nest this for it to work a little better for us. So there you go. Also a matter of getting the right selector in there. So we actually are applying grid to the UL now. Okay, so now each LI is a grid item. You can actually stick, I'm in Chrome. I believe Firefox has the same capability where you can kind of stick this display that pops up. So we can see that each list item is a grid element, and by default, those are in row orientation. And so a quick method to flip the orientation, if that's your main goal, is to change grid auto flow to column. I'm updating that. So you can see now that they quickly got lined up in a row. However, unlike Flex, we do not, for grid, have any way to direct it just by a single property, direct it to route, which is why, for now, Flex is often the choice. We can do it with grid. Some of you may be ahead of me in thought or in chat. We can do it with grid template columns instead and be a little more explicit and allow some wrapping behavior. And so the way to do that is grid template columns. We use the repeat function to say, do this every time you encounter an item. We use the auto fit keyword. And I always have trouble verbalizing what that does. But it is going to, it's going to say, instead of repeat for like 3 items, it's going to say repeat every time you encounter a new item within the grid. So it lets you be less explicit, but still apply those repeated attributes, I guess. So, and then within this, we nest a min-max function. So I'm throwing a lot of new functions potentially at you. And I have a lot of material on this specific technique, by the way. If you're not quite catching it now, it's actually the very first one on small CSS. I've written a lot of tutorials about it. I even have videos about it because it's like magic. It's like the thing that made me excited to use grid and like the biggest immediate benefit that I got from using grid more often in my layouts. So min-max lets us set 2 values. The first one is the minimum, essentially allowed value. So again, so I'm on my nav, so I probably want this to be sort of small. We might have to adjust this. And then a max, often the value that gets put here to make it truly responsive is 1 FR. Where FR is a unique unit, I believe it actually stands for fraction. But if everything is set to 1 FR, then they will all equitably share the space that's available. Okay, so let's see what it's actually doing and we can address anything else. Okay, so a couple of things happened here. One, it's automatically created a new line, and that's because the available width here, because I have my code edit over here and I actually have the inspector creeping in too, has narrowed it below the threshold where each item could have taken up 15 CH. So in other words, without a media query, that's one piece of grid magic that lets you automatically rearrange your layout. A big difference from Flexbox is that, again, those are going to stay a rigid width. So you can see that here, actually. So if you want your nav to continue to be variable width based on the elements, then Flexbox is still what you're going to want to use. But if this is the behavior you're after, maybe we'll just knock down our min so that they can all fit on a widest viewport. There we go. Then, yeah, you might be totally happy with that. Of course, we haven't removed list styles, but once we do that, we probably want to add in a grid gap. I also tend to, personal preference, base everything around rems. If you're not familiar with the rem unit, or haven't considered why you see it in use a lot lately, it has to do with it maps one rem is equal to the base font width for the document. And versus pixels, it's going to adjust if the user has system settings changed to a different font size.
So if a user, for instance, with a vision impairment has like large text settings, then this will adjust based on, okay, wow, okay, gotcha.
Yeah. So whereas currently, I did get a chance to test on a PC recently. Pixels will not, at least not as cleanly. Okay, so I'm just double checking what we had here. I obviously missed something. Oh, wait. Okay, I'm like, wait a minute.
Yeah.
All right, I tried to pluralize that. That's not going to work. Okay, so now my elements are being spaced by a combination of the min that we have in place, and also in between, we're now relying on grid gap versus a margin or padding. So what I would love, but is currently will not work, is if this min max could be based on, we have a few other really interesting sizing properties or sizing values available to us. So for example, max content, as well as min content. So max content is going to stretch as far as the content, and min content is going to shrink the element down to the smallest width. So whatever the longest word is, if it's a paragraph, it's going to shoot down to that width. And if this worked that way, which it doesn't, and it's not going to, I had that confirmed by somebody on CSS Working Group, then we could get the nice variable width functionality, and it would be like all my dreams come true. I really wanted that to work, but it doesn't. So again, this was a good demo to just quickly walk through some of why grid is awesome, but probably I would recommend still sticking with Flex.
Do you mind if I ask a couple of questions about grid from the chat?
Yeah.
I have to scroll up. We've got some people who are loving watching this thought process. Okay, so the first grid question, is subgrid a thing yet that I should worry about at all, or is that still future stage?
As far as I know, it is not quite there yet. I don't know if it's off of Can I Use. I know it's actively being worked on. We could also go out to, so just Firefox.
All right.
Looks like it's not even in technical preview yet. But I don't think I can navigate it to it quite quickly enough. But you can actually go see what the CSS Working Group has in draft and is working on, if you're interested in those kind of things. Right. It may not be kind of easily available from browser makers, but.
We've got another question. This is from Codelex. Codelex is wondering whether you would recommend using CSS classes for every HTML element, or is it much better to use like tag selectors such as nav-ul? I guess in general, what is your selector strategy if where you have control over that?
Yeah, excellent question. And it hugely depends on context of the project, and also whether I'm the only developer, like a personal project, versus in a team environment. And so as a personal project developer, where I am the full owner of the architecture,
Mhm.
I'm a big fan of applying styles globally until it doesn't make sense. So,
Mhm.
I'm only going to have one nav. So do I need a class? Not really.
Mhm.
Things like that. Or setting up my basic, again, if we look back here, um, if you remove the content, this is, and the asides, like this is the setup I always start with anyway, for anything that's going to significantly have content. So in that respect, you have a header, a nav, a main, and a footer. The footer is the one that can sometimes get me in trouble, but we can resolve that because sometimes I'll have a block quote or an article where I also bring in a footer since that's allowed.
Mhm.
But we can resolve that by using the direct child. That's not quite the right name. Direct.
Yeah.
Uh, anyway,
But this says any footer that's directly a child of body and not like a
yeah,
grandchild.
exactly. So yeah, if we did just this, then it would select the ones that were inside of our articles or anything else.
Mhm.
So not too bad of a fix. For clarity, definitely if it brings you clarity in your styles, if it helps
Mhm.
you with organization, then absolutely add classes. In a team environment, or even as I begin to add more componentized styles, I am a fan of kind of a modified version of BIM once I get down to it. So as you can see for style stage, because I knew it was, I was giving it out there generically to the world, they're not BIM style. They're very functional, maybe or kind of categorized style. So it's the profile. This one's an ID, so I didn't add a class. And I did add a page footer, mostly to help you with organization in your
Mhm.
styles. But overall, try not to insert too many opinions just for this particular project,
Mhm.
um, because of the idea being it's contributors with many, many different opinions.
Mhm.
So trying to provide kind of just enough. And as you can see from the styles, seems like it's been okay for most folks. So, um, but cool. I know we're not going to have too much more time.
Yeah.
Um, were there any other questions that we can look at?
I think that's it for now. Again, some people saying that this is like a game changer for them. They're really appreciating how the clarity that you're presenting, your
Cool.
thought process here. So, what
Yeah.
other tricks do you have? How else might you use modern CSS to breathe life into this?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I said I would get to one of my favorite selectors. Let's do that. Okay, this is brand new, like only the latest versions across Safari, Chrome, Firefox, Edge would be included as well. Okay, so if you haven't yet heard of it, there's a new selector in town called the is selector. And this is like the most magical thing. It's going to literally change every style sheet you write in the future. Because instead of instead of writing H1, H2, H3, blah, 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 basically, and then supplying styles that way, we can completely condense this down and put them inside of is. So it's saying match any of these selectors within this group, hence the is. um, one important thing to know, so for example, I'm in this case, let's see what I want to do. So I kind of already added spacing with my container class. So I don't really have any, like in an article situation, a blog situation, um, you might do something like this and use it to quickly add a margin top or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
I actually think I have that in, this is my newest demo here in our box sizing or our document sizing. Um, actually, maybe I'll just copy this over real quick and then talk about it. Um, and so by itself is, I might say this incorrectly because it's brand new, if I remember correctly, has fairly low specificity. But what we can do, so for example, if then after this I had like an article and I scoped it, the article would definitely take precedence, even if it was prior to the is. So low specificity, not going to override the cascade just by itself, which can be really good, especially if you're thinking of setting it as a global scale, but then you have a component, you're going to have, it's going to still be easy for you to override it. The exception is once we start adding compound selectors. So this one just got a little more complex. So what's happening here is now that I've added an additional qualifier to say that it's not the first child, so not the first H2 or H3 that maybe leads off an article or an aside, then that's the only time I want to apply this margin top. And now because I have extra, probably not using all the super correct terms, I need to learn them so I could teach it better. It's just so new. I've scoped it down more, then it's going to have it now has a higher specificity. So it would override in the previous example, if we had an article H2 down here, it would override it for specifically ones that are not first child. Hopefully that makes sense. Definitely something to look up later, learn more about is. But even just with these two styles, let's run this. It's probably not going to see a huge difference, but we'll see what happened. So mostly what's happening here is on my H1, 2, and 3, I've adjusted the line height to 1.2. Usually when things start wrapping, if this was 1.5, it just feels like too much at a larger font size. So that's what that's about, is just reducing it a little bit. Whereas 1.5 is, I think, actually the WCAG success criterion for general legibility of body text. And then if we had this scenario, which I don't think we do, maybe this one, if it's not the first child. But yep, so here we go. You can see that's being attached to this H3 because it is not the first child. So there we go. So basically the point of this rule is adding a little extra spacing to those nested sectioning headers.
So the selector that you've got here, this is H2, H3, not first child. This is, if I'm understanding this correctly, equivalent to H2 not first child, comma, H3 not first child.
Yep.
Which is like, okay, saves us a bit of characters, but it's especially killer if you have to do like that. I want either an H2 or an H3 like in the middle of an already like verbose selector, I would imagine, is where the extra power for this lies.
Awesome. Yes, and the other really interesting feature about this is if you have if you write selectors like this, if one of them is not understood by the browser, the whole rule gets thrown out. Which can bite you if you have this, this is not going to apply in this situation, but if you have rules that, require like a WebKit, like some sort of prefix, and if you combine that with the non-prefixed version, it's going to throw the whole entire rule out for browsers that doesn't apply to. Is doesn't work that way. Is will still apply to the matching elements, which is also very cool. If you're wondering when that situation might actually happen, check out how to style a progress element. That is one area that one would hit you. Because there still is a proprietary selector, at least last I checked, which was about a month ago. Things seem to be changing super rapidly now, which is also very exciting, especially as we look to use these modern properties. I'll say one other thing before we leave this particular rule is that this is also a really nice progressive enhancement for something like headline styles, right? If this fails, it's just going to be 1.5. Nobody's That's fine. If this fails, it's just going to be tighter to this element. And again, that's fine.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's safe to use. If you got more complicated with this and it was like your layout was depending on it, then
Mm-hmm.
yes, you would need to set up some fallback styles. On that note, in terms of contributing to style stage, I will do some light checking. I won't completely dig through your style sheet, but there's some things that I might notice. I will check it across browser. I will the latest versions. I won't look at it in older
Mm-hmm.
Internet Explorer or something. Um, and I will check it on a real mobile device. By the way, always check on a real mobile device if you have that
Mm-hmm.
available to you. You will find things that you don't expect that are not going to show up um, in, that's obviously not going to work very well, in just trying to spoof it with the inspector. Partially because touch is going to work different than,
Yeah.
than scrolling, right? So, and if you have different viewport things in place, I've also been hit with overflow that does not show up when I use just inspector, but it does show up on a real device.
Mm-hmm.
Or occasionally support will be green here, but something still breaks. So always test on a real device if you have it available to you. Cool.
Jared in the chat is saying another fun one is where the where pseudo selector. I bet if you need even less specificity, where is like is, but always has zero specificity. Oh,
Nice. Yeah, I haven't had a chance to play with that. Is just because is has made more sense to my context. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm very conscious of only sharing things that like I've had the chance to use, and so I can attempt to share them in kind of good faith that it's okay. Basically.
all right. Yeah, I know we're getting close to time. I think there's still probably opportunities if there's other things you want to share. And I think we might be able to get to a few last minute questions. If you've got any, please stick them in the chat. Now is the time for that. Is there anything else you wanted to show off for this page? Like anything else that's really got you excited right now?
Great question. Let's see. Um, I guess another selector that can come in handy for this project is attribute selectors.
Okay.
So for example, we have a few different kinds of links. Ones that are quote unquote unique, not just the native link element, are star on GitHub, and then the ones that show up down here in this list have a class on them. So if we wanted to create a rule just for kind of in-text links, we could say PA, we could do LIA. But what we really want is to attach to links that don't have a class. So we can do that. We can say link, not class. So this is an element selector. You can use it for any element, including like custom data attributes. If you have scenarios where you're using that. I'm going to use, so one other property I'm super pumped about is text. Oh, and then I'm going to forget which one it is, and it's not going to show up. It's super new. It's a text decoration offset or a text underline offset. Can't remember. I think I have it over here though.
Do you when you're creating resources like these, are you in part creating them so that you can come back to them? Because like I found that
100%.
that's yeah, I found that's one of the like the biggest incentives for like me to like blog and that kind of stuff is just like I want the snippet out there live so I can Google it.
Yes. I constantly go back to these things. I think I joked about this on Twitter recently. I was like, yeah, it's so I don't have to Google and
Mm-hmm.
or go diving in my repos to find the thing.
That's the biggest like motivation for search engine optimization is I want to find myself.
Love it.
What did you know,
Super valid.
Paspen?
Okay, so okay, here's the correct property. Okay, I'm gonna save and then we'll look at what it did. Watch these links. It's gonna jump a little bit. You see how it bumped down the completely native out underline text decoration underline. It's now given it a little more space. Just gives that little boost of, to me, readability,
Mm.
legibility, I should say. Um, and there's a couple other properties that can go hand in hand. We did it quite a bit on this one, so it's actually clearing the descenders, so like the tail on the Y, if you're not sure what a
Mm.
descender is. Um, anyway, so, but it did not apply to our links that have a class. So, the inverse of that would be an A that has a class. So maybe you want to give these like a button style or something. So
Mm.
definitely don't discredit attribute selectors. Can do some very sophisticatedly clean work in a hurry using them.
All right. Looks like we did get two questions in the chat. First of all, Nasty Director, are there any upcoming CSS features that you're particularly excited about that you'd recommend having a look at? So I guess things that aren't out yet but are coming down the pipes.
Yeah, top of the list, container queries.
Okay.
um, that is in what's the correct term? That is look, I'm searching my own resource. Okay, being prototyped, that's the word I'm looking for. And I need to keep checking on this. I think this is still the current status. So Miriam Suzanne, she is on the CSS working group, and this is the actual proposal for container queries. So in other words, being able to define in a media query-like way, but based on a container versus the viewport to resize things. So the key is the container versus the viewport. And that in mind, what we showed with this grid, like that gets us close. And that for me has actually solved a lot of scenarios that I have wanted container query-like behavior. Oops, wrong way. Another one that I have over here is doing the same thing with Flexbox. The difference in behavior for these techniques versus a container query is that this you're kind of relying on a preset algorithm to do it for you.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas container queries is going to allow you to essentially set breakpoints on the container and adjust that behavior. So definitely more granular control is what that's going to offer you.
Right. And then Anthony asks if you could be any CSS property, which one would you be?
Oh, goodness. That's a new one. Oh, man. I might have to think on that one and tweet about it later. Any CSS property.
Well, on
Great one.
on
It's a
on
great
that
one.
on that segue though, on you tweeting, if you want to get Stephanie's answer, which I'm gonna be eagerly awaiting, you should go follow Stephanie all the places. I have put a whole bunch of links in the chat. Stephanie, this has been fantastic. I've learned so much. Do you ever just like watch like a master at their craft and you're just like, this is incredible. Like I've learned a lot. I know the chat has learned a lot. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I will save this. Obviously, we didn't get very designy with it, but I will save it just for reference, and I will send that link as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Y'all, chat. If you enjoyed this, next week I'm going to be trying my hand. It's just gonna be me. I'm gonna see if maybe I can get like a camera for my cat as well. So it'll be me and my cat. But we'll be progressively enhancing our way to a rating widget. So like selecting like 4-star, 5-star rating, that kind of stuff. Trying to go just as bare bones HTML, CSS, fun with selectors, as far as I can possibly get without having to bring in JavaScript into that. So they'll play on some of the like modern CSS stuff that we talked about here. So I'm super looking forward to that. Thank y'all for joining us today. And have a good one. I'll see you in a week. Oh, Night Bingo. The name of the cat is Tuna. So we will have the tuna cam. Um, uh, Tuna permitting, of course. Yeah. So have a good one, and I'll catch y'all in a week. Bye.
Bye.